thick. That's not a huge mushroom, but they are thick. But look at the color, the bright color of the cap. So the family of Hygropheraceae has two genera, Hygrophorus and Hygrocebae. It's not a Hygrophorus because it's not huge, and it's the Hygrophorus, as it says in the thing, has kind of a pale cap. But look at Hygrocebae at the bottom. Cap small, medium, bright colored. Gills are waxy, stipe slender and brittle, but it has no ring, so it's a Hygrocebae. And you would tell because of the gills being thick. Okay? Okay, this is a pink spore print with attached gills. Now we haven't done any pink spores yet, so let's do this. Okay, so that's key 3. Okay, this was growing on the ground. I should have said that too. Okay. Key to gilled mushrooms with pink spores. So gills are free growing on wood. They're not. This one was growing on the ground, and I need to change that to make that clear to people. Gills long decurrent. Not at all decurrent. They're just plain old attached. Gills not long decurrent, attached in some other way. Okay? Thin, fragile, cartilaginous stalks thin. Well, they're not tiny thin. When we say thin, like the mycenas, that are really fragile and thin. So some of these are skinny stems, but they're not real fragile. So you go to the far right. Fleshy, fibrous stalks, medium to large size, not always, and it looks like a tricholoma type. It doesn't exactly look like that because the entelomas can be smaller. But again, you could get confused here. But it doesn't fit any of the other ones, so it's a matter of elimination. So that's an entoloma, and again, none of those are edible, and some are very poisonous actually. Now we're just going to talk about mushroom spores. So do you have a feeling for how to kind of begin to identify, and this is just the gilled mushrooms I'm talking about. I'm going to show you pictures of all the other different kinds just because they're beautiful, but we're not going to figure out how to identify those. But just going to talk to you about mushroom spores a little bit. That's how they grow. That's their seeds. When the spores drop out of the ground, and they produce millions of spores. A medium-sized mushroom can produce 20 billion spores over a 4 or 5 day period. But you think all of those spores that are spread out by the wind usually, they have to land in the right place, with the right substrate, with the right amount of rain, the soil's got to be right, So sometimes in our mushroom club, we'll go 5 or 10 years before we see a specific mushroom. We'll go, wow, it's dry this year, so that one's growing. It's a real wet year, that one's growing. So the conditions have to be right for the spores to, they perform little hyphae, little thread-like things that come out, and then they all join together and create that mycelium, the mass that produces the fruiting body. And they're tiny. Spores are all different shapes and sizes and stuff too, so they're cool. I love playing with the microscope because it's fun too. But they're really tiny. They're only microns, a thousandth of a millimeter long, and you have to have a microscope to see the actual spore. And we've already talked about the spore colors. You guys have that down. Now the spores can be lots of different shapes. Some of them, like the entoloma back there, if I wasn't sure if the key was right, if you look under the microscope, it's the only genus that has 6-sided spores. Most of them are round, look like a little football. Some are, puffballs are absolutely round, and they have little spines coming out of them. So the spores, the shapes are all different sizes. And if somebody just gave me a spore, I could probably, without even seeing the mushroom, figure out what family it's in at least, just by looking. Now the ways the mushroom produces their spores, it depends on the kind of mushroom. On the ones we've been talking about, this is the gill mushrooms. They're right along the edge of the gill. But on boletes, they come in the pores. On hydnums, the spines and teeth. They actually have little spines. They're really cool looking. And some have folds, like the chanterelles, smooth surfaces, ridges and pits like morels, and tips of little branches of the cauliflower mushroom Romaria. So let's take a look at some of these. So this is I've listed a couple of the genera that have gilled mushrooms, but this is an example of a gill. And the spores, like I said, are produced on the edge of the gills, and they are carried by wind currents. Then this is in the Boletus family, but it's a xerocomus. It's got the pores, there's a little hole, looks like a sponge underneath, and most of these are edible. Now, I should just tell you one rule, which I should put that down in here somewhere. If there are most all of these are edible that Boletus like, but if they have red pores, not yellow, either most of them around here will have yellow or white. If they're red pores, they're deadly. So that's another thing I need to add. And like the Suellus have these pores too, but the staining is important. See, when I picked this up, I bruised it a little bit. See this blue? If I were to cut this mushroom in half, the whole thing, the whole inside will turn bright blue. So the deadly one has red pores and stains blue when you cut it in half. It's called Boletus satanus. Nice name. Okay, so that's the only one, and I've never seen any out west. I know they have them on the East Coast, because most people eat the pored ones, so just to let you know, there is a bad one out there. Now here's a cool one with the spines. See the little spines? They're real soft, but the spores are produced on the edges of these little spines. So that's a whole other family of mushrooms besides the gills. So you've got the ones with the gills, you've got the ones with the pores, now you've got the ones with the spines. And then you have the ones with the folds. All the various chanterelle type species have these folds. This is not, a gill, you can kind of flick it off with your thumb like a store-bought mushroom, but these folds are actually part of the surface of the mushroom in chanterelles. They're not fragile, they're firm, and they don't come off. And they're always decurrent. So then you have folds that have the spore-producing surfaces on them. And then you have in the chanterelle family, but a different genus, very smooth back. The surface is very smooth, and again, the spores are produced there and just drop off and are spread by the wind. And then you either have morels or Helvellas, Gyromicras, brains, all those kind of guys have all these ridges and pits and stuff, and the spores are on the cap on all those ridges. Then you have the Romaria, were actually on the tips of all those branches, and most of these are edible too. Some cause diarrhea, but none of them are going to kill you. But there's a lot of spring ones that people find here in Bocau, and they love them. So that's a Romaria species. So again, the spores are either carried by the wind, most of them are carried by the wind, some of them insects carry them, like the coprinus, they just disintegrate, turn to that black inky mass. That's how they disperse their spores into the ground. Oh, there's one with raindrops. I'm sure I have the picture. This is so cool. And what disintegration is the puffball. They just fall apart. Autodigestion is the one that coprinus that inkies and just slops, and all the spores just get into the ground that way. Or animals eat them and they're spreading their feces. So those are the various ways the mushrooms get their spores into the environment. So let's just take a look at some pretty ones for fun. This is a mycena that has a much bigger site than normal mycenas. It's a beautiful pink thing, and it spread its spores into the environment just from the air. Oh, this one is cool. This whole family, there's lots of stinkhorns. Now see, they have no gills, they have no pores, they have no spines. What they have is this sticky, smelly, gooey gleba, it's called. And it stinks like rotten flesh. And that smell attracts flies. And the flies land on it and they eat this because it's stinky. So the flies fly away somewhere and they have the spores on their feet. So they land somewhere in the environment and the spores come off their feet or in the feces of the fly. So these are really cool mushrooms, but man, we don't keep them inside when we find them. They sit out on the deck. And some, we don't find them every year because they're very unusual, but what an interesting mechanism to get your spores dispersed for future. I mean, I think it's pretty cool. And we do see these here, but not often. And as I talked about puffballs, they just fall apart and disintegrate. So the spores puff out when they're dry. You know, it starts out fleshy and firm and white and good and edible, and then once it dries out, all of the puffball family, they just disintegrate, and the billions, the mass of all the spores are just carried by the wind. Now these, let's see if I can cheat. Oh, I didn't include it. Okay, I gotta do that too. Okay. Anyway, what this is, it's really cool. Its common name is bird nest fungus. These are tiny. They're probably the half the size of a pea. And you'll find them on sticks in the forest. And these are the things we find when it's a dry year and we don't see the giant things. We're crawling around our knees. This actually starts out with a little covering over it to protect the spores and keep them moist. And then the rain comes along and this little covering disintegrates. And you have these little things that look like eggs, which is why people call them bird nest fungus, only they're this big around. But this little egg requires a raindrop to fall in it, and then this little thing, the little egg, flies out in the environment, and attached to this little tiny thing is like a little thin root with a hook on the end. And it flies through the air and wraps itself around another twig somewhere and then sits there and produces again. So it requires the rain. And you will see these. If you crawl around next to the creek bottoms and stuff and see this little tiny thing, that's how they disperse their spores. They require rain to get them out. And I already talked about coprinus and how they just auto-digest and the inky goo gets into the ground and the spores are kept moist that way. Now, the truffle. This is not the chocolate good thing to eat. This is even much better. But truffles never come above the ground. So it's very difficult to find truffles. They're exceedingly expensive because they taste fabulous. So in order for them, since they never go above ground, how do they get their spores out into the environment? They have this great mechanism where they have produced this unbelievable odor. And in Europe, they use pigs to find the truffles because they smell. Only animals can smell it. We can't smell them. So it smells like a male testosterone pig. So they let a female pig out in heat into the forest, and she'll go right and find and dig up all these truffles. Well, since the pigs, that would be $200, $300 worth for those two little truffles that are this big. I saw one in Italy last year that was this big. It was worth $2,000. They had it for sale. I went to a truffle festival over there. So they exude this unbelievable smell where the animals can't resist it. And sometimes you'll see little flies above the ground, and they smell the truffle too, and they'll go into the ground and eat it. So it requires an animal to dig it up and eat it, and then it's it's spread on top of the ground, the animal's feces. So I'll tell you a little story real quick because it's kind of cool. We have some friends in Montana, and they have 3 teenage kids, and the parents are good friends of ours, and they wanted to go to Hawaii for a year. So I said, okay, we'll watch the kids. Well, oh my God, you know. This kid's got to be at soccer at 3 o'clock. This one's got to be at music at 3:15, and you know, it's like, okay, I'll do this once. So anyway, we did it, and we were exhausted. So we're home, and we get this little package in the mail, a little tiny package. And Dave goes, oh my God, somebody sent us something, and it's rotten. Something had, you know, must have been kept at the post office or something. So I open up this little tiny box, and it's a little tiny cooler, and it's got 2 Italian truffles as a thank you. I could smell it out of the ground, and it stunk like crazy. I thought it was something rotten, but it was a thank you gift, and it was 2 black truffles from Italy as a thank you gift. But I mean, the smell, you cannot beat it. But you just, they are so strong that you just have a few shavings is all you have on pasta, and that's the end of it. But that's how you find them. So to find it, now in Oregon, people have actually taken the spores of a truffle and inoculated, I don't recall the kind of tree, but they've inoculated the roots of this tree and have, after 11 years, the mycorrhizal relationship, that's how long it took to form, but those people are now finding truffles and selling them commercially. Wow. So you can do that. Morels, they haven't figured out how to cultivate them. I mean, you know, you see stuff in magazines, buy this dirt which has morel spores. I've done all that, done work. You know, you can't, it just doesn't work.
The Statesman had an article this year about a guy that planted an orchard of some, I forget what the tree was, but they go around looking for the truffles.
Yeah.
And he trained his dogs to stuff them out, didn't he?
Well, they do that now in Italy. They train dogs because the pigs eat them. And if they're, you know, $200 for one little one, you don't want your dog eating them all, or you can't control the pig. You can control your dog usually. So, anyway, and they're real ugly looking little things, and they have false truffles. The only time I've ever found a truffle, I was hiking in Hell's Canyon, and sometimes you'll see a little crack in the ground, not a mushroom coming up, but just a little raised crack, and I dug underneath it. Found some Oregon black truffles, and they were fabulous. That's the only time I've ever found them. So this is this is a crack, a big crack in the ground. Sometimes you'll see that in the forest. The mushroom hasn't come up yet, but it's trying to break the ground. And then this one grows in the sand. It's a picture of the Hope lent me from Orson's collection. That they found in Australia, and it grows only in the sand, so you have to pay attention to the substrate, you know, is it on wood or the ground or whatever, but the little mushroom hump, we call them shrumps, you know, because you see them in the forest when you're looking around for mushrooms. Sometimes you won't even see the mushroom, but if you dig underneath, you'll definitely see the mushroom. Now when you go out hunting for mushrooms, I'm telling you, once you get into this, it is so easy never to look up or orient yourself where you're going. Because you see a mushroom over there, then you see one over there, and all of a sudden it's like, where am I? So all of us in our club carry a whistle for sure. And I carry a compass and a walking stick because you never know where you're going to end up. And I see people collecting morels in plastic bags, and I just can almost not take it. It makes them rot. They'll get infected within hours. You really need to use either a wax paper of some kind, wrap them in it, a brown paper bag. A basket is the best. I carry a basket. Because also when you carry in a basket, as you're walking through the forest, all those spores are coming off and spreading around for the future. So I always carry a basket. Never plastic. Always have a raincoat with you. You never know what's going on. And if you feel like it, a camera and a notepad to make make, make notes and stuff, but